So happy you've joined today's Lunch and Learn, the Employed Domestic Violence Victim, Rights, Risks, and Remedies, sponsored by Hamilton Law, tenacious, passionate, ready to tackle any challenge. This session is being hosted by Victim's Voice, creator of the Victim's Voice app, the only legally admissible documentation tool that allows victims to safely, securely, and privately store the evidence-based details needed for stronger protections, better investigations, and more appropriate prosecutions. Victim's Voice, giving victims a legal voice. For more information and to find out about our new EAP solution, visit us on the web or through our social channels as shown here. Today's Lunch and Learn, the Employed Domestic Violence Victim, will be led by Lynn Fairweather. Lynn is a domestic abuse survivor who has worked in the violence response and prevention field for the past 28 years. In her role as president of Presage Consulting and Training, she provides expert guidance and education to professionals in both the public and private sector, ranging from the federal government to multinational Fortune 500 corporations. She has also served as a subject matter expert on a variety of corporate and community projects, civil and criminal cases, and legislative issues. Before founding Presage in 2008, she earned a bachelor's degree in social science and a master's degree in social work. Ms. Fairweather's specialty in domestic violence threat assessment and management was developed by working on thousands of high-risk cases through positions in social service, criminal justice, university, and shelter systems. She has served on several interpersonal violence task forces and facilitated both victim support groups and batterers intervention programs. She serves as the president of Oregon's VOWPAC and is an active member of the National Speakers Association, the American Society for Industrial Security, and the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. Ms. Fairweather holds training certifications from multiple institutions such as Homeland Security's Federal Law Enforcement Training Center and Gavin DeBecker's Advanced Threat Assessment Academy. She also writes professionally on the subject of domestic violence, releasing her book, Stop Signs: Recognizing, Avoiding, and Escaping Abusive Relationships. So without further ado, I am very pleased and excited to turn it over to Lynn Fairweather.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I really am pleased to see that so many people have taken time out of their day to be with us and to learn about this important topic. It is going to be interesting. I am wearing red today to keep everybody's attention, but I think the material will do that in itself. We have a large variety of professionals with us today, and I know that some of you are advocates. That has a special place in my heart because for the first 18 years of my career, I was a direct service advocate. And I did see that there were a few folks from Florida here today. That is where I actually began my domestic violence career 28 years ago in a little shelter in Daytona Beach, Florida. I know that as advocates, you all try your best to give the victims that you work with as many resources as you possibly can. But it wasn't until I started working with corporations and public and private employers that I started to learn just how powerful of a tool and a resource the employers can be. So we're going to talk about that a little more today. And the other group I would specifically like to welcome are people who are professionals in public or private organizations, folks who do HR, security, things like that, that help victims of domestic violence in the workforce and that touch cases. I am very pleased to see you here because it means a lot to me that employers are willing to look at this issue. And when you find out just how important this issue is and how much it's impacting the workplace, I think that you may be interested in learning more about what businesses and organizations can do. So we're going to begin. I'm going to do my screen share here, and this is my first time on Remo. So I am definitely hopeful that we will be able to see my screen here. So, as many of you heard, I am somebody who has been not only professionally involved in domestic violence for most of my life, but also personally involved. And one of the reasons that I do what I do is because I was working at the time that I was involved in domestic violence, and I was not in a position where I felt like I could talk to my employer about it. I was actually involved in that situation while I was working in a domestic violence organization, which is not as uncommon as people might think. And even in that place, I still felt reluctant to talk to my employer. So we're going to do a little bit of information to begin with about the issue of domestic violence in the workplace, and then we're going to move into some more information about how people who are employed and experiencing domestic violence can get help from their employer and how employers can be of assistance. So the first thing that I want everybody to understand is just how incredibly common this issue is. There are estimates that 1 in 5 currently working adults is a current victim of physical, sexual, or psychological abuse. And most victims do work. Let's go to the next bullet point, Sherry. 75% of them actually do work outside the home. So people are not in a situation where they are necessarily homebound or not allowed to work. Many people are on a full-time basis working outside the home. Next. One of the things that many of you already know is that when domestic violence is present in the home, it doesn't stay there when the victim goes to work. What happens is that it spills over into the workplace. And we find that about 3/4 of victims of domestic violence who work say that it has impacted their workplace in a number of different ways. So let's look at some of those ways. Next point. You can just pull them all up, Sherry. So one of the ways that this happens is that the abuser is tracking or monitoring or stalking or harassing the victim through the phone, either their own personal device or the workplace phone. And as you can imagine, this becomes incredibly disruptive, particularly if the abuser also comes to the workplace and acts in a harassing or threatening manner. That can affect everybody in the workplace, not only the victim, but their coworkers and perhaps the general public if that's present in their business. We see a lot of harassment, intimidation. There are many acts of violence and threats that do take place in the workplace. We'll look at that in just a moment. And we also see a lot of sabotage, and that is when an abuser is doing something to professionally damage the victim. So perhaps they might be telling the victim's employer that the victim is doing something wrong, embezzling money or cheating the company. They might go ahead and send out embarrassing emails or photographs to the victim's coworkers to try and humiliate them and cause problems for them in the workplace. So as you can imagine, going to work when you are experiencing domestic violence at home and the spillover has a lot of impact on victims. What happens when they experience spillover is that it impacts their work life as well as their home life. And we're going to look a little bit more in just a moment about how it impacts the entire workplace. But for now, we'll focus on the impacts to the person who is being victimized. They often experience more physical and emotional mental health issues than somebody who is not being abused. So you could have somebody who's trying to go to work when they have a broken arm and they're required to lift boxes, or somebody who is in a public facing position and they've got a black eye or injuries on their face. That can be extremely difficult for them to endure. Next bullet. There is also sabotage that occurs before a victim goes to work, which is designed to make it harder for them. So an abuser might do things like hiding the victim's car keys, changing their clocks, refusing to provide childcare. And these are all ways in which they can impact the victim's workplace before they even leave the home. Next. You might also imagine that somebody who is impacted by domestic violence experiences disruptions in their career path and trajectory. Over the lifetime, they do not earn as much as somebody who is not abused, because in many cases, they have to leave or quit their job as a result of the spillover. Next. And lastly, coworker relationships are impacted, as well as the relationship with the employer in general. When somebody is experiencing domestic violence, they may be late to work, they may not be able to keep up with their tasks, and their coworkers often have to cover for them and have to take up the slack. Coworkers get very concerned about a victim who's being abused, and they get concerned about safety in general in the workplace. So that can strain relationships. In addition, victims often believe that they can't come to their employer because the employer might not see them in the same light. They might not see them as somebody who is intelligent or makes good decisions or is strong. And that's a concern that keeps many people from talking to their employer. So at the extreme end of domestic violence spillover, we see violent attacks in the workplace. The security directors that I work with reflect to me that roughly 25 to 40% of the workplace violence they have to deal with is domestic violence related. We're talking about roughly 18,000 acts of domestic violence in the workplace every year. So 1 out of 4 large companies is going to have a domestic violence incident on site. Another thing that has emerged in research over the past year or two is that many of the mass shootings that we have seen, in fact, roughly 57% of them over the past few years, have had roots in domestic violence. So this is another way in which the public and many other people in a victim's life can be potentially at risk because of their situation. There's a number of ways that an attack can play out in the workplace. One is that it begins at home where a victim is hurt, and then the abuser goes on to either their own workplace or the victim's workplace to cause problems or hurt people there. The attack can happen while the victim is at work and the abuser comes to the workplace. And in this case, we also may see corollaries, which are people who do not have anything to do with the situation, just an innocent bystander, a coworker, somebody like that getting hurt. Unfortunately, that does occur. There is also, in many cases, a dual employee situation, or even a tri-employee one, where the victim and the abuser work at the same location. And this is common because many abusers will force their victim to get a job where they work, or they will get a job where the victim works because they want to keep tabs on that person. So you have a lot of situations in which they are in the same workplace, which can create some specific challenges for employers. Lastly, there is the emergence in the past few years of what I call hybrid attacks. And these are scenarios in which workplace violence and grievances in the workplace combine with domestic violence issues. So you may see somebody who, for example, in the Cedric Ford case, a man received a restraining order at work, and he get very upset with his employer, the way that that was handled. And he ended up going to his car, getting a gun, and coming back and opening fire on his coworkers. So these are the ways that these attacks can play out, but it's important to know that while they are rare, they do happen, and it is part of the reason why we need to do this type of education and training. So when you are considering whether a victim is likely to be attacked in the workplace, or one of the scenarios we just talked about, we want to ask a few questions. And this is where my threat assessment and management background comes in, because we do know that there are certain behaviors that are correlated with attacks on the workplace in particular. And so these questions that you see in front of you right now are questions that can be asked to assess the risk of an abuser coming to the workplace to hurt the victim. Do they know, the subject would be the abuser, do they know when and where the victim works? Have they ever threatened anybody in the location or the location itself, or including the victim? Has the subject ever actually been there? And if they did come to the location, what happened? Was there threats or violence or other issues of concern? And has the subject previously harassed, stalked, or assaulted the victim at any workplace? So it could be a former workplace, just not the current one yet. How many people are actually telling their employers when they're experiencing domestic violence? Now, what we know from various research is that about 56% of domestic violence victims do tell a coworker that they are having problems with domestic abuse. Only 23% of them actually go to their supervisor. 20% will call EAP and speak with a counselor, and only about 10% will report to human resources. And part of the reason that victims do not disclose more is, number one, they are afraid of losing their job. And as you can see on that last note, roughly 30% of domestic violence victims have either lost or quit a job as a result of the abuse. Other reasons include their concerns about confidentiality and their concerns that their employer may not be able to help them and that they may not want to be involved or have any way to assist, which, as we're about to find out, is definitely not true. So if you are somebody who works with domestic violence victims, you may be wondering, how does this person go about approaching their employer? The first thing that I would recommend is that they choose a recipient for this information that they are comfortable with. So that could be a manager, it could be somebody in human resources or a security officer, anybody who they know and feel comfortable talking to. They should definitely try to do this in a private scenario, and they want to try and get as much vertical service as possible. What that means is that they are talking to the same person or couple people throughout the entire situation with their case. This reduces them having to retell their story over and over, and may feel re-traumatizing. But it also puts everybody on the same page, and there's only a few people who will be involved directly in that case. It's important that victims who are talking to their employer be concise and talk about how particularly their work may be impacted or the workplace may be impacted. It's not that employers can't help victims of domestic violence if it's not impacting the workplace. They still can help and do. However, victims should be aware that they don't have to tell their entire story from start to finish. They just need to go in with questions prepared for their employer and have some kind of an idea of what they would like to have happen. What they would like the employer to do or accommodations they would like them to provide. And one of the ways that you can get a heads up on what these might be is the victim can look at the workplace policy and find out whether it is a standard employee behavior policy or if it is a specific workplace violence or domestic violence policy. They can find out what the company does in terms of approaching these cases. So domestic violence victims do have rights in many states, and the laws in the US are kind of a patchwork. So you may have very different scenarios happening in one state than the state beside it. However, many states do have employment laws, and they may actually, in some cases, ask the victim to certify that they are a victim of domestic violence before they take advantage of these protections. And that could mean supplying a police report or a doctor's letter or something of that nature. But not all states do require that. Some laws depend upon whether it is a public or a private company, or how big the company is, because the laws dictate that employers of a certain size or in a certain industry must have accommodations prepared. There is a website right here listed on the slide, legalmomentum.org. That is a fantastic organization, and they have a state-by-state domestic violence law guide for employed victims. So you can find out exactly what your state does offer. Another source for that information is by checking either the national or the state's Department of Labor website. And a list of those can be found at dol.gov. So these laws can cover a number of things. They can cover employee retention, the protection of somebody's job status, and they can cover leave of absence or paid or unpaid time off. They can cover unemployment compensation for individuals who do have to quit their job or are fired from their job because of domestic violence. They can protect people from discrimination and retaliation based on their status as a domestic violence victim. There are also OSHA regulations and the Occupational Safety and Health Association. They are a regulatory body that does have laws in regard to an employer's responsibility to keep employees safe in the workplace. And that is a more complicated topic than we have time for today, but it does say that most employers need to provide what is known as reasonable safety accommodations. So that could be reasonable for the situation or reasonable for the company itself. Here are some of the remedies and accommodations that an employer may be able to offer for victims. They can change that person's schedule, their role in the company, their actual location, either within the facility or the actual work site that they are in. And these do have to be preferential changes. So the victim cannot be forced to do any of these changes, but they also cannot be put in a position where their job or their privileges are diminished because of this. There can also be adjustments made to their communications, meaning they're perhaps removing their name from a public directory or having their calls routed to a security office if they're getting harassing phone calls. And there are also steps that can be taken from the administrative and payroll departments. So the administrative department, for example, can change the emergency contact on a victim's employee file because it may be the abuser. Or they can go ahead and make adjustments to the amount of time off that person has. They can offer a payroll advance if somebody needs money to help them achieve safety. And they can arrange for insurance benefits, for example, to go to somebody else. There are access control measures that the security team at the workplace can provide. And this means whoever gets in and out of the facility, and in addition, who has access to information on the computer. Some companies, for example, have scheduling tools where coworkers can go and look at each other's schedule and see what's happening for the day. But obviously, if there are dual employees, the victim and abuser work together, you don't want them to have access to that. On-site safety is also crucial. So an employer can provide a safe room off the floor, which is a lockable location where an employee can go to find safety. They can provide wraparound escorts for parking so that the employee doesn't have to walk out to their vehicle alone. They can also do things like arranging two-way communication so that the victim has a way to contact security, or even code words that can be used to keep that person safe. One example I often give is a client of mine that was a large supermarket chain, and they had an employee whose abuser kept showing up at their publicly accessible store. So they created a code word which told the victim that their abuser was there. So if they said over the PA system, "Jennifer, clean up on aisle 4, Jennifer knew that that meant her abuser was there and she needed to go to the safe room. In addition, there are things that employers can do, and this vastly depends on who the employer is and what their capability is, but there are things that they can do to help someone be safe or get the funds that they need to be safe. For example, some of the clients that I work with in large multinational corporations are willing to pay for everything from hotel rooms to security alarm systems to personal protection devices. There are many employers out there who are willing to give somebody paid time off or to do other things that will help them to achieve safety. And that's a very personally tailored to the case kind of a situation in most scenarios. And lastly, an employer can also refer a victim to resources that they may have not known existed. And hopefully the employer has partners within the community that they can directly refer a victim to. So it's important to know going in, if a victim of abuse is going to talk to their employer, what that employer's capabilities are. So in most of the domestic violence employment laws that protect victims, there are caveats made for what's called undue hardship. Undue hardship means that the employer would be put out in such a way that it would perhaps not be feasible for them to follow the accommodations. So for example, if somebody works for a very small company and there's only a few employees there, they may not be able to get the time off or the location change that they request because it does present an undue hardship for the company. Look at the company's policy. And this is where I referred to earlier on a slide, how the company feels about domestic violence and how they approach it. So hopefully they will have what is called a company stance in the beginning of their policy that talks about zero tolerance for domestic violence in the workplace, that talks about how the company feels toward the issue and understands what victims might be going through. It's essentially a statement of support for people who go on to read the rest of that policy so that they know that the company does care and is aware of the issue. There will sometimes be in policy a list of prohibited behaviors in the workplace. This is definitely not an exhaustive list. There are many different ways, as we learned earlier, that the workplace can be impacted, but there may be specific behaviors that are called out. Hopefully, there will be a statement to domestic violence victims in that policy that tells them they will not be fired just because they are coming forward about domestic violence, that their confidentiality will be respected at all times, and information will be provided on a need-to-know only basis, and that there is going to be some kind of action that is done for them and toward the abuser if the abuser is also an employee. Often there will be a statement to potential violators of the policy, which tells them that their violations will be investigated and that there will be consequences for that up to and including termination. Some companies do include information about restraining orders, that's ROs on the slide, because they mandate that if you are the recipient of a restraining order, that you, if you're the respondent, that you go ahead and inform them that that is occurring. And that's important in dual employee cases because the employer can be responsible for upholding the parameters of that restraining order in the workplace. But it's also even important if there is not a victim working alongside that abuser in the same company, because if a company, if it is found that a company has allowed an abuser to use their resources, a company car, a company phone, a company computer, to abuse a victim, then the employer can be held liable for that. So that is why some employers do want to know about that. And lastly, there should be statements in this policy that talk about the coworker's duty to cooperate if they are asked questions about the incidents or the entire situation in general. There may be information about a duty to report if you are aware of security issues related to domestic violence. And there may also be information about non-retaliation, meaning that particularly in dual employee cases, that a victim will not be discriminated against or retaliated against in any way by their coworkers because of their situation. So when I mentioned before resources that an employer can provide for people who are experiencing domestic violence, there are basically two different avenues. So we have the internal resources that are available through the company, and we also have external resources that are usually available in the community. So the first one on our list is human resources, EAP, which is confidential, whereas HR may not be 100% confidential. They may have a duty to report things to the employer. The EAP does not have that same duty, except in cases of imminent threat. The Employee Relations Department may be involved. The Employee Health and Wellness part of the company may also be involved. And I see on the side chat here that somebody asked about examples for employers being responsible for the abuse issued while using company collateral. I don't have off the top of my head court cases that I could let you know about. Sometimes those are not public knowledge, but there are definitely situations in which employers have been held responsible. One that I can think of that I don't recall the name of, I'm sorry, but I can recall the situation, is that the abuser was using a company vehicle and leaving the location of their workplace and going to the victim's home. They were driving by the victim's home, stalking the victim, and the whole time they were in a company vehicle. And so that was a scenario where the victim was able to, in a suit, hold the employer responsible because they were negligent in their retention, supervision, hiring, etc. So if it can be proven that the company should have known or knew what was going on and didn't do anything to stop it, then they can be held responsible. Local community-based domestic violence resources can be extremely helpful, particularly if the company has a pre-existing relationship with that local organization. So if they, for example, provide funding to that organization, or if the company has a volunteer program through which they provide services and volunteer services to the local domestic violence organization, that's great. Because that way the employer can do what's called a warm handoff, meaning they're not just telling the employees, hey, call this 1-800 number. They're actually saying, you can call this local number and speak to this person or the advocates on the team of this organization, and they can help you out. We would definitely want to make sure, if you are an employer out there, you want to make sure that those resources are accessible, that they are culturally competent, and that they are no cost to the person who is accessing them. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is a number that some of you may be familiar with. It's 1-800-799-SAFE. I try to give this number out as often as possible because the National Domestic Violence Hotline not only is a free, confidential 24/7 service, but they also can be reached by text. They can also provide services for people who do not speak English as their primary language. They have a large language bank, so they can work with folks, and they even have a TTY line for hearing impaired individuals. So they're a great resource, and I definitely recommend giving that out because no matter where the victim's located in the country, they can provide some kind of a resource for that location. Local law enforcement is also a group that we encourage employers to have contact with and pre-existing relationships with. That way, a local law enforcement officer, either in the domestic violence unit, which is a specialized unit, or through advocates that work for the police bureau or work with them, the police can help employers to understand the threat that they're facing. And they can go ahead and give the employer tips on safety. They might even be willing to do drive-bys in the parking lot during the victim's time that they are coming to and leaving work. And there are a number of ways that they can make the response from law enforcement a little bit more understandable and effective. The district attorney's office in many places also has a specialized DV unit and may have a team of advocates that are there to help victims of crime and domestic violence victims. In addition, legal aid can also be a resource for those who cannot afford an attorney of their own in a domestic violence related civil case. And I find that prosecution is greatly improved when the victim is working side by side with the district attorney's office. They can even offer protections against witness tampering, and they can even help to provide funds for victims to perhaps leave town, come back for the trial, to keep themselves safe within the same city. There's a number of ways that they can assist. And lastly, I have on this list 2 organizations that people don't frequently think of many times when they are thinking about getting help for domestic violence victims. And that is Human Services, the Department of Human Services in each state. Many states have a domestic violence fund, a grant that they provide to individuals to provide things that will help them with their safety. So those grants can go toward hotel rooms, they can go toward travel vouchers, other types of protections. And the other one that's on here may cause some advocates in the audience to kind of squint a little bit, because sometimes advocates have difficult relationships, adversarial relationships, even with the local child protective unit or child protective department. And that is because in some cases, they will take the children out of the home based on the domestic violence that's occurring, even though the victim is not the one perpetrating it. And some victims are very concerned about talking to child welfare, especially if they have had a case with them previously or involvement with them before. But the reason I have them on here is because what I have found is that if you go to them first as a victim of domestic violence and say, I need assistance with what's happening in my home, many times they can also provide assistance to you, both financially and support-wise, to help you do that. It would be wise to talk with an advocate first, a local advocate, because they can give you a better picture of how the local child protective system works, and they may even be able to assist with making that contact. Somebody on the chat said they would also like to mention animal shelters and programs for victims, that the Humane Society near them is a way to take in animals and keep them safe. This is super duper important. Kelly, I really appreciate you mentioning that. During the domestic violence that I experienced, I had a dog at the time, and she was also abused by the abuser as part of his power and control tactics. So I know that this is something that happens a lot. Upwards of 70–75% of victims in shelters who had a pet say that their pet was also abused in that situation. So that's very important. And when I do see somebody put that 33 states now allow pets in a protective order, Sherry, you put that in there, and I love that. That's really helpful. So let's talk for a minute about protective orders, because when people in the workplace are informed about domestic violence, sometimes their first gut reaction is, well, go get a restraining order and that will make you safe. So I like to discuss with employers and domestic violence victims and those that help them exactly what the pros and cons are of restraining orders. They are a powerful tool for the criminal justice system to draw a line in the sand and hold abusers accountable. They're also a powerful message to abusers that it's not just the victim that you are up against now, it is going to be the entire state, the court, everybody. So we are stepping in on this. And, you know, they might just work. And so that's a very good tool in some cases. However, in other cases, they may act as what I call a heater, which is an action of intervention in a domestic violence case that actually exacerbates the violence and makes it worse. So this may be a situation where the tipping point for that abuser is the issuance of this restraining order. It's also true that a restraining order is a piece of paper. At the end of the day, it's not bulletproof. And sometimes people get a false sense of security when they have a restraining order, thinking that that will make everybody safe, which it doesn't. In domestic violence, they are violated roughly 60% of the time. So there are a number of different kinds of protection orders that you could get. And if you did seek a restraining order, or if you're seeking one on behalf of a victim, trying to help them out or recommending it to somebody, it is important to ask a few questions about how the abuser has talked about restraining orders in the past. For example, have they ever threatened the victim specifically around getting a restraining order? Have they violated one in the past? Are they somebody who is very reactive to law enforcement intervention? So another thing I also want to mention is that if you know when a restraining order is going to be served, it is very important to ensure the victim's safety around that time period. The 2 weeks to 2 months after a restraining order is served is frequently a point of highest risk for victims of domestic violence. There are a number of different kinds of restraining orders that can be helpful in these situations. There are domestic violence restraining orders, or family protection orders, as they're sometimes known. And as many of the advocates are aware out there, that can cover the victim, their children, their workplace. It can cover exactly what type of communication could be permitted. So for example, if someone has children with their abuser, they may need to communicate regarding childcare scheduling. And there are also provisions that prevent third-party contact, proxies that might be used by the abuser. So that is a tool that can be included in the intervention plan. There are also specific stalking orders for people who did not have an intimate partner relationship with their abuser. There are harassment orders in some states, and again, this is state dependent. There are harassment orders that will allow somebody who has not yet been the victim of an assault or a threat, but is still concerned about the contact that they're receiving. So a harassment order may be part of that. There is also something called a no contact order, which is different than a domestic violence restraining order. A no contact order is often issued when somebody is released on bail after they've been arrested. The judge will say you are not allowed to contact the victim for a certain period of time, at least until trial. Or they can be folded into a divorce decree as part of the requirements that both parties are supposed to follow. I don't love those because, to be honest, they don't have as much teeth as an actual restraining order. An actual restraining order is more powerful in the sense that if it's violated, it is a crime as opposed to just a contempt of court kind of a charge. Employers in some states can also get a corporate restraining order. In virtually, I believe, every state, they are allowed to trespass somebody from their workplace. But what is stronger and more permanent can be a corporate restraining order, which will allow the employer to say to an individual, you are not allowed on our grounds, you cannot come here. And that takes the onus off the victim. It makes it so it's the employer saying you can't come here, not the victim, and sometimes that works better. So many of you may be wondering, what about working from home during the COVID pandemic? This has increased domestic violence worldwide by about 25%, and it has also created conditions in which victims are not as able to get the kind of help they could have earlier from either the workplace or the community. So it's important for employers to know and victims to know that OSHA rules will still apply, but the employer must be informed of what's happening, because it's not happening, if it's happening at home, it's not happening on the employer's grounds, but it is under their workplace time. It's also important to safety plan individually with people who are working from home, because that safety plan is going to look a little different than a workplace safety plan that might be in place otherwise. The safety plans for work from home should include secure devices and alternate channels of communication. So if you can't call your employer or video chat with them, perhaps you can text them or email them about something. Employers should put together a protocol of asking yes or no questions initially when they speak to someone that they think might be abused. Because if the first thing they say when they get on the phone is now a good time to talk, then the victim can say yes or no. And they can also say things like, are you safe right now? And the victim could potentially say no and ask for help without actually saying it, because there's a very good chance the abuser is going to be right there in the same location with them. There can be code words or signals that are set up between the employer and the employee so that when they're talking, they can let each other know, or the victim can let the employer know if they are safe or if something is wrong. And those can be unique to the situation. There should also be an action plan for what the employer is supposed to do when those codes or signals are activated, or if the employee just is a no-show for a video conference, for example. And there are also at-home individual safety planning mechanisms that can be utilized. And again, we don't have time to go into that too much today, but the advocates would be able to help with that. I did mention these earlier, so I won't go too deeply into this slide. It's very common for there to be more than one person involved in the same workplace in a domestic violence scenario. And sometimes there can even be more than one person when you have, I don't love this word or this phrase because I think it minimizes the issue, but a triangle of employees in the same location. In order to address this, if you are a victim who is working with their abuser and looking to approach the employer about it, check what the workplace violence policy says regarding this. There should be information about it. And again, you can ask for those preferential changes to schedule, location, roles, etc., so that the abuser does not have the same type of access anymore to the victim. There can be security oversights and escorts, and again, the employer might have a responsibility to uphold the specifications in the domestic violence restraining order. This is what a seamless safety plan looks like, and this is what I encourage workplaces to provide, not the providing the outside of work part, but trying to connect the inside of work safety plan with the outside of work safety plan. So as you can see from these circles, the safety plan goes where the victim goes. It talks about safety planning in the home, in the workplace, in the victim's school, their children's school, out in public, in transit, or other places that they might be during their day. And basically it focuses around how to blend these together so that those gaps in between the circles are covered. So if you are somebody who is experiencing, or you're working with someone who's experiencing domestic violence, it's important to have your workplace plan seamlessly blend with your out of work plan. And an advocate can help you to do that, as well as the people within the organization. So one of the things that you can do as an advocate or somebody who is trying to communicate with an employer about domestic violence is to educate the employer on the impact of it. So obviously there is a threat to the overall workplace safety, but many employers, I find, underestimate that, and they tend to think it won't happen here. There won't be a workplace attack here. And unfortunately that catches them off guard. But beyond those obvious safety issues, there are also matters of financial impact. So for example, the average domestic violence victim is absent up to 3 days a month, and they do not have the same level of productivity as somebody who is not being abused as a result of all that spillover. So the employer is losing money on people who aren't showing up to work, showing up late, or unable to complete their tasks. The average domestic violence victim has 36% higher healthcare costs than somebody who is not abused, and that can impact the employer's bottom line in regard to physical and mental health care costs. There is also a great deal of turnover associated with domestic violence. That third of victims who has had to quit or leave a job because of it. And there's also an issue of morale, particularly if a victim is fired. That creates a chill effect. And when other employees see that, they are less likely to come forward with their own issues in the future. And lastly, there's a number of ways that employers can be liable for domestic violence that occurs. And even now, as I said before, while people are working from home, the employer still does have some responsibilities. So we won't get into the legal weeds on that today, but it's important to know that this does impact the employer and the workplace and their bottom line. Sometimes that is the information that gets employers motivated to address this. If the employer won't help, it could be because undue hardship is applying in that situation, but it could also be because they just don't know what they can do. So it's important for people who are approaching their employer to do a little bit of research into the policy and what they would like to have happen. And I have here the phrase honey first, vinegar last, because when you're approaching your employer, you want to go into it in such a way that you're asking for a certain type of support, a certain level of support, but you are not yet at the point where you're saying, hey, you need to do this for me. If you do get to that point where you have to apply a little bit of vinegar, then there are other avenues that can be taken. So if an employer is unwilling to assist, they can be told about the Osha laws, and Osha can be contacted either locally or nationally to help them understand what their responsibilities are. Same thing with Department of Labor. And it is an option for a victim who has been mistreated by their employer in regard to domestic violence to sue that employer in civil court. So this can be done through either an employment law attorney, a personal attorney, and a victim may have a case because their employer didn't do what they were supposed to do. Lastly, some people have gone to news outlets or social media outlets to express their concerns about how the employer handles domestic violence, and that impacts the employer's public reputation and public relations. So we hope that employers are willing to help out victims of domestic violence without being pushed on it a little bit, but if they must be, then these are some ways that that can be accomplished. All right, so this brings us to the end of the information we have today, and I know that was a lot to take in. So what we're going to do with the next few minutes is we're going to have a Q&A session, and as far as I understand it from Sherry, this will be extended into the after program networking. So I would love to open up the floor now. And as Sherry noted, that questions can be put in the chat, and then we will try to pull them out as they come through.
Well, thank you so much, despite all the technical glitches here. Okay, let's see. So would this program be able to be adapted outside of the United States?
100%. Many of the employers that I work with are multinational employers with locations all over the world, and they have successfully taken this in a sort of a trickle-down way from the headquarters, the operational headquarters, all the way down to every single aspect of the company around the world and every location. So it does have to be tailored a bit because, as you can imagine, cultural differences, differences in laws, etc., will impact that situation. So it does have to be tailored to the nuances of that region or country. But yes, this can certainly be done. If it can be done in the US, it can absolutely be done elsewhere.
Excellent. How do these laws impact public schools? Are there any differences in the requirements of lawsuits that might result?
Well, schools are a bit of an unusual situation, aren't they? Because in many cases, there's a high potential for corollaries. You've got a lot of kids that are in the school and people are concerned clearly about it. In fact, it was a school teacher who spawned California's Prop 400, which is now a law, that says that an employer cannot fire a victim of domestic violence simply for being a victim of domestic violence. But schools are public locations in many cases, and not always, but they are public entities. And so they will be under the Obama era law that says they must have a program in place. They must have remedies, accommodations, and policies in place to help victims of domestic violence. Private companies are not held to that same standard.
Excellent. And then we're going to take one last question, and then we're going to move it over to the networking hall. And to answer a lot of people's questions, yes, we will have an on-demand of this. Lynn, I'll talk to you about that later. With the low percentage of reports to HR personnel, how do you recommend HR educate employees in general that they will actually participate?
Great question. That is a twofold answer, because first of all, people in HR definitely need to be aware of the 3 R's: recognize, respond, and refer. So how do you identify victims of domestic violence? How do you go ahead and sensitively, effectively respond to their issues? And how do you refer them to the most helpful resources? Once HR is trained in that capacity, then they can do a lot more. And part of what we do for a lot of companies at Presage is we put together employee awareness campaigns. And those are different channels with which you reach employees to let them know how they can get help, either within the company or outside of it. So that can be everything from presentations to break room posters, paycheck inserts, internal facing websites, things like that. So the idea is to create a channel between HR and the employees where the employees feel that they trust HR and that they can come forward without risk. And that can be accomplished, as I said, with an awareness campaign.
Excellent. Also, I just want to note that Victims Voice will be releasing an EAP type solution to allow employees to be able to document so that if they don't feel comfortable going forward to HR, they will still be able to have a tool that can help them through that.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So Lynn, oh my gosh, on behalf of the audience and Victims Voice, we'd like to thank you today for the Lunch and Learn program. For those of you who still have further questions about the material covered today or whose questions were not addressed in the Q&A portion, please feel free to contact Lynn directly. Also let us know in the chat that you have further questions, and I'll make sure she's able to reach out to you directly. You will receive a survey, yay, pertaining to this event. Your feedback is really crucial to our future programming, so please take a 5-minute coffee break and just fill it out. Upon completion of that survey, you will be provided a link to resources and the recording of this presentation. So now let's go back to the networking hall and be able to chat and network there.